Good day, students. I trust all is well, and we'll get started with our study as described here on this first page. If you haven't read the essay first, I would suggest that you go to thefathershouse.org, and there you can click on the blog button, which will lead you to this essay that we're going to be covering today as we look at this PowerPoint presentation. You'll want to read that first because I think it'll give you much more general knowledge of what it is or the topic that we're talking about. More detailed knowledge, I guess I should say. The title of this is Perception, the Epistemological Starting Point, the study of Locke, Berkeley's, and Aristotle's epistemological approach to the question of perception and the nature of reality. The purpose of this study. In the study of epistemology, it is understood that a philosopher's position on the notion of perception and reality are pivotal when considering how one should view immediate objects. Within the field of the philosophy of knowledge, there are many different starting points, all of which will lead to a determinate view of one's perception of reality. The reason I put determinate view there was because wherever our starting point is, we're going to find is going to produce a different end point for each and every one of us. So if our philosophical starting point or a theological starting point is a correct one, then it leads us to problems that we ultimately either have to unwind or we have to abandon our position on the philosophy or on the theology. This project will look at three different epistemological views, those of John Locke, George Berkeley, and Aristotle. This report will look at their specific views on the matter, determine the strengths and weaknesses of their arguments, and apply logical rationale as the outcome of their positions on the philosophy of knowledge. John Locke's representationalism, the image theory of perception. John Locke's epistemology. Locke's epistemology is best known as representationalism, which the Oxford Dictionary defines as the doctrine that thought is a manipulation of mental representations which correspond to external states or objects. His belief was that all knowledge is attained through sense data, and therefore our ideas are only representations of reality. So the idea is that in his mind is that we can't really know a person or a thing really. We only have an idea about who they are or what they are. It would be, this representation could be like that of a photograph of your mother. Well, that photograph could be a good photograph or it could be a bad photograph, but it's only a photograph, and that's what Locke is insisting, that we can know about reality. We can only know a representation of it. We can't know that which really is. Understanding what Locke means by ideas is critical for comprehending his epistemology, and we're going to talk a little bit here about ideas and his concept of ideas. Locke's gateway to understanding is one's comprehension of this theory of simple, complex, and mixed modes, as was discussed in his work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. As we go forward with this, when we're talking about simple modes or mixed modes, he uses synonymously the word idea with modes, so modes and ideas are one and the same in Locke's epistemology and thought. Simple modes or ideas are singular particulars that will eventually be used to construct complex modes or ideas. It's one unit. It's the idea of the greenness in grass or the blade in the grass. It's one thing by which, or one thing that represents what grass is. So it's just this one basic unit is what he calls a simple idea or a simple mode. Complex modes are the joining together of simple modes whereby the mind becomes active in constructing combinations of simple ideas into a unified complex idea or ideas to extend to external states or objects. So what he's saying here is that although we might bring in a new term for grass, let's say grass, and so we maybe call it turf, and that word turf would only really incorporate the idea of what the singular things were about. So turf would stand for the greenness which is in grass. Of course, we'll talk about that later as a secondary quality, but the length of the grass or the depth of the roots. But still, he would want to break it down almost to a nominalist position as opposed to a universal idea that Aristotle would employ or that he would suggest. Locke seems to hold on to a pseudo-nominalist construct that implies that all complex ideas are only brought under a universal banner in order to describe the multiple simple ideas. And that's just kind of what I tried to explain. But Locke has an epistemological problem that I think needs to be looked at. And his problems are the idea of that Locke's simple and complex ideas leads him to a precarious position when dealing with the perception of reality. How can one know their ideas represent objective reality? Again, how can I know that this portrait of my mother actually represents my mother's? It's a copy. It's almost like this. On your right here, you have a portrait of John Locke, but how do I know whether that really represents him or not? I don't know because I've never met him in person. I would assume so, but there's so much more that I don't know when I look at this photograph, or this in this case, in this portrait. The ideas are subjective by nature. Then how is it that one can get out of their mind and view reality as that which it is? Well, to answer these two problems, Locke employs the use of primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are those qualities that essentially belong to bodies, namely solidity, extension, figure, motion, and rest. Locke would call these the substratum, or the substrate of what an essence or an object is. Secondary qualities such as color, odor, and taste do not essentially exist in the object, and therefore have no basis in our perception of reality. It would be simply like saying, taking a tomato, for example. So let's say you take a tomato, and you would say you can know a tomato by its form, maybe by its size, but you can't know a tomato by its color, because that color is something that can be changed, and therefore that secondary quality doesn't really exist. Only primary qualities are those things that really materially exist. These essential qualities reflect Locke's universe as a geometrical form. So it's kind of like the idea of what you're looking at here on the right is you're seeing a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge, and it's actually an architectural drawing of the Golden Gate Bridge. And what he would be saying here simply is this is all we can know. We can only know the geometrical form of the Golden Gate Bridge. We can't know anything or speak to its color, or the water running under it, or the smell of the air around it, because these are all secondary qualities and not primary. They're not primary qualities. But that kind of leaves Locke in a dilemma, doesn't it? How does Locke know that his ideas are representative of tangible material objects? On your right again, you can see this is the Golden Gate Bridge, but how do I know that that really resembles the Golden Gate Bridge? As a matter of fact, how do I know that that even is the Golden Gate Bridge, unless I've seen the Golden Gate Bridge, and I can kind of bring the two or blend the two together? How does one get out of their head in order to have a clear comprehension of material objects? It's kind of the same questions, right? How can Locke defend his position for the existence of primary qualities and the non-existence of secondary qualities? Well, it's at this point that George Berkeley enters into the argument, and you have to understand that Berkeley himself was an idealist. So it's not that he's not in the same camp. He just doesn't think that Locke's notion of idealism goes far enough. And so really what he sets out to do in his writings is to expound on, or be the finger pointing them to the moon, saying that what real idealism should look like should be somewhat different than the way that Locke perceives it. Berkeley is probably the one that contended with Locke's notion of idealism more than any other philosopher. There is no reason to believe in the existence, and this is kind of his argument. This is where he starts his argument, right? There is no reason to believe in the existence of mind-independent material objects. He takes exception to Locke's notion that there is a difference between primary and secondary qualities. And so kind of what's happening here is this notion of the Golden Gate Bridge as a substrate, which kind of how Locke describes it. And so he kind of says, well, wait a minute here. How is it that the substrate, you say, exists and is not an idea, and yet you say that color doesn't exist? And he would use the argument to say simply, when examining the Golden Gate Bridge as a material there, can you observe it just as a geometrical form, or do you have to observe it, and that being an idea, but don't you also have to have the idea of the redness of it in order to understand or comprehend it? So if one doesn't exist, the other doesn't exist. You can't differentiate between primary and secondary qualities. And this was kind of the change or the pointing of direction for Berkeley, because he kind of really pulls the covers on Locke's notion that he couldn't, or that he didn't, and that the fact that he didn't go all the way. We are not presented with any mind-independent, as argument again, we are not presented with any mind-independent material objects in our immediate experiences. Here's Gallagher's quote on that. It says, his complete formula should read, esse est aut percipere aut percipe. To be is either to perceive or to be perceived, for he allows that there are two ways of being, as a mind or as an object of the mind. I exist, and the objects of my conscious experience exist, my ideas, but that's all I can mean by existence. Berkeley's argument continues, there is no such thing as a mind-independent material, there's no such thing as mind-independent material objects, because there is no evidence to support the notion. And what he's basically saying is, how do you know they exist if there's no evidence that they exist? But he does really believe they exist, and the reason is because of his notion of God. His last argument was to establish the absolute mind, whereby all things exist in the mind-dependent absolute, which would be God. Therefore, things exist, whether we perceive them or not, they exist because they exist in the mind of God, or the absolute mind, as ideas. It is Berkeley's stance that he uses to validate that all material objects exist because the absolute mind perceives them. But George Berkeley, he too has a dilemma, doesn't he? Similar, very same in some cases to where Locke is. Is the epistemological idealist's perception of how one should view reality valid? How does one get out of their own minds in order to have a clear comprehension of material objects? How can Locke and Berkeley defend their positions for the non-existence of qualities? Well, there's the scene here. Aristotle has a much different view on the matter, and so we'll take a few minutes to look at this. Aristotle's epistemology starts with that at birth we are like a blank slate without impression or knowledge. All knowledge is learned through sensory perception that is an accumulation of previously conceived memories. Particular knowledge of a thing becomes categories or concepts. In his book Categories, Aristotle identifies really 10 different categories whereby a thing might be known. However, in Aristotle's mind, the three most important categories are quality, quantity, and relation. So if a teacher was to use Aristotle's epistemology, it might sound or look something like this. A teacher using this method begins without the students knowing what a particular object is. The student begins asking questions. Is an animate object or an inanimate object? The teacher replies, it is alive. Another student asks, is an animal or a plant? It is an animal, she responds. Does it have 2 legs or 4? 4, she says to the students. Is it a dog? No. Okay, what type of nose does it have? A very long one. Is it an elephant? Yes, the students reply. Okay, we have answered the questions and we have arrived at the answer. She replies, yes and no. You've answered what the species is, but not the particular animal that I have in mind. With another round of questions, the class comes to the understanding of a particular elephant with the name of Tina that lives in Las Vegas and performs at nightly shows. Aristotle's process could be described in a nutshell is systematic, utilizing inductive and deductive logic to arrive at a particular reality. The system starts with observations about phenomena, and then through the induction process, various questions are asked that lead to general principles or universals, which employ deductive logic to know, with some degree of certainty, what the phenomena being observed is. Comparison and contrasting them, we have to look at this. Again, the questions, how does Locke and Berkeley know that their ideas are representative and tangible material objects? How does one get out of their mind in order to have a clear comprehension of material objects? How can Locke and Berkeley defend their positions on the non-existence of qualities? Aristotle's philosophy answers these questions. Material objects exist and they can be known through sense perception. Aristotle's epistemology answers the idea of primary and secondary qualities because in his theory of knowledge, these primary and secondary qualities do exist. They in fact do. Concluding thoughts. While examining these questions, it is evident that Aristotle is on a much more stable foundation. His theory of knowledge does not have the same problem with perception that the idealists do. The idealism of Locke and Berkeley places them in a world that does not have any existential import. Idealism believes all material things can only exist in the mind as ideas, period. Aristotle's epistemology puts one in direct contact with material objects. They are known by employing inductive and deductive logic, working from particulars to universals, or a sort of a whole. Universal knowledge places one in direct contact with particular material objects. This essay has looked at 3 different epistemological views, those of John Locke, George Berkeley, and Aristotle. It has looked at their specific views on the matter, determined the strengths and weaknesses of their arguments, and applied logical rationale to the outcome of all their positions on the philosophy of knowledge. Thank you very much for your time.